Well, good morning. Thank you for joining us today. We are very honored to have three special guests with us to talk to UCF about their work and their ongoing and perhaps some lessons we can learn from their work that can be applied globally as well, including to the United States. So I want to first acknowledge my colleague and friend, Hakan Azoglu, who is the director of the UCF Middle East Studies program. We're having a little trouble connecting with Hakan right now. He was going to make the introductions, but I just wanted to acknowledge him. And I'll get started. I'm David Dumke. I am the executive director of the Office of Global Perspectives and International Initiatives. We have with us Gary Mason. Gary is a reverend and a doctor who is Belfast-based. He is the founder. He has worked for years on healing societies in starting in Ireland, but has now worked as well in the Israeli-Palestinian issue as well. Gary has done so many different initiatives working on and is constantly talking to Americans and others around the globe about coexistence and shared spaces. And I just want to say he has been a special friend to UCF, and I thank him so much for joining us today. He is also the founder, I want to say, of Rethinking Conflict, which was founded in 2015. The organization seeks to model the principles of the relationships in the historic Good Friday Agreement and to work on peace and reconciliation at the societal level. We are also joined today by Meredith Rothbart, and I want to acknowledge, first of all, that we misspelled her name on the flyer, so I apologize for that, Meredith. Meredith is the co-founder and CEO of Amal-Tikva. She brings 10 years of experience working with Israeli and Palestinians NGO and project management, development, strategic planning, and leadership. She is joined by her colleague and co-founder and CFO of Amal-Tikva, Basheer Abubakar. Basheer is a CPA, MBA with 10 years of experience in the private sector and 10 years working with Israeli and Palestinian NGOs as a financial manager. Amal-Tikva is an initiative where philanthropists, field experts, and organizations come together to support civil society peace building between Israelis and Palestinians. Their goal is to create a more peaceful reality defined by less hatred, tension, and violence, increased quality of life, improved systems for interaction. And I'm going to let them explain some of their work, but I first would like them to get started and how they got involved in these efforts. And we will start with our friend, Reverend Gary Mason. Gary?
Okay, thank you, David. And again, just a thank you, CF, for these initiatives. I just think they're crucial that we're hearing each other in what's a very messy space at times globally. David, I don't want to do a long, protracted historical outline of the Irish conflict because, again, depending where you want to start, we could rewind the DVD to the 11th or 12th century, or the 16th or 17th century, or the early part of the 20th century. I often say in any spaces where there's conflict, invariably there's three concepts: land, identity, and religion. And those three concepts have been fault lines running through the island of Ireland literally for centuries. When our conflict that I lived through from 69 to 1998 began, a friend of mine who did end up getting involved in terrorism or political violence, as many men and women of my generation did, he said, in the late 1960s, someone did not fly over Northern Ireland, spray us all with lunatic gas, and we all woke up someday and said, let's start killing each other. So it was a context to how the conflict broke out in our space. And I would argue that it was bad politics and also toxic religion that were creating fault lines running through that island literally for centuries. In relation to religion, we had what I often call a kind of theology of superiority. I am definitely right and you're definitely wrong. May sound a little bit like the United States at the moment, but that we felt superior to the other person, both politically and religiously. And so those fault lines were active, and literally in the late 1960s, we spilled into 30 years of a civil war. Northern Ireland's a very, very tiny space, 1.6 million people. And during those 30 years, we had 47,000 injuries, 36,000 shootings, 22,000 armed robberies, 16,000 bombings, and almost 4,000 dead, and 30,000 political prisoners. I often say those statistics seem quite small. Let me extrapolate those statistics and put them in the context of the United States. So very simply put, if the Irish conflict had it taken place in the United States, you would have had 800,000 dead and 6.4 million political prisoners. So if you were to say to me, Gary, what do you do today in the island of Ireland? It's utopia there. It's all hugs and kisses. It's not, because most of my work today is dealing with the past and dealing with legacy. And it brings me to talk about really what you call a political peace process or a social peace process, with your colleague of mine and a close friend, Joan Brewer, who's a leading sociologist, talks about this whole concept that politicians assume, may I suggest somewhat naively, that once the deal is done, that societal healing will automatically follow. So, I mean, if you look at my space or look at Israel and Palestine, let's assume once the deal is done in Jerusalem or Ramallah, or in the lawn of the White House or Downing Street, London, that societal healing will automatically follow. I mean, I'm assuming no one is saying today in the United States that you're immediately post-election going to move immediately into societal healing. Because societal healing literally takes generations. And that's why I want to argue very strongly that politicians are important in a peace process. But I also want to say categorically and unashamedly, academics are important. Women's groups are important. Religious leaders are important. Business people are important. So we need what I kind of call a sort of multi-disciplinary approach to peace. I mean, looking back at those 30 years of violence, I was just thinking today and saying, in 1972, when I was a young boy, there was a terrorist incident every 40 minutes. So every night I went to sleep listening to gunfire or bombs going off in the distance and sometimes not in the distance. So the Irish space, like many other spaces, is a very traumatized space. I would argue that those who inhabit the Middle East, both Palestinians and Israelis, are traumatized. History has traumatized them in different ways. As I look at the United States, there is a trauma there, the legacy of slavery and racism. So we were comparing those three spaces, and I'm not arguing that they are identical, but what I'm saying is the issue of land, the issue of identity, and the issue of religion that are running through all those spaces. I'll pause there, David.
No, that's great. It's a great introduction and start. I'm going to turn to Meredith.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? My name is Meredith, and I am going to take a step back, I guess, and give a little bit less of a context to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is still very live and active, unfortunately, today, and give you a sense of what our work is like, mine and Basheer's, and what we're kind of dealing with and struggling with and working with on a day-to-day basis. Gary is a close mentor of ours. We actually speak very regularly. And at one of my breaking points a few years back, starting this work, I was actually on the cusp of quitting and starting to look for a different role in some other context where peace building wouldn't be so hard and I could just, work in high tech or something else. And I actually happened to stumble upon a context where Gary was leading a training for young peace builders, and he could speak about his conflict in the past. And that was enough for me to keep going and feel like, wow, to imagine that one day we could speak about this in the past tense and talk about post-conflict resolution and use all the tools that we're building now, just about building the future and figuring out how to maintain peace instead of starting from scratch. So you can tell from my accent, I grew up in the States. I'm from Pennsylvania. Yes, I voted absentee, don't worry. And I've been in Israel now since 2007. My family came a lot when I was little. We were very Zionist, grew up in a very religious Jewish community. And I never really thought about Palestinians other than to be a little bit afraid of them. But I didn't really know who they were or come across them. And so I didn't think about them very much. When I moved to Israel, following some of my siblings and eventually my parents joined, I studied in a religious seminary and was waiting for my military draft. I had some random time to kill, and I ended up volunteering over the summer at a program called Kids for Peace. It's a summer camp bringing together Jewish, Christian, and Muslim campers from the Jerusalem area for a peace building experience. And the reason that I volunteered there was because a friend of a friend knew that I was American and the camps were in the States, and one of the staff didn't get a visa. It was very random, and it changed my life. I was the worst counselor Kids for Peace had ever seen because I didn't know anything about the other. And 6 years later, when I was the director and giving my pep talk to the team before each summer camp, I always told them, don't worry, you can't be as bad as I was. The reason I felt it was such a challenging experience was because I was working with my Palestinian colleagues and had no idea what their life was like and continued to make mistakes and offend them. And I had difficult translating even from Hebrew to English because I couldn't explain to the youth what they were hearing and what they were experiencing because I didn't understand it myself. And when I went back, I specifically requested that my military service would be in the civil administration in Kogat, which is the Israeli military occupying force in the West Bank, because I wanted to be in it from the Israeli side, and I wanted to learn it in and out as an Israeli. And so for my military service, my job was serving as a liaison to international organizations that were building infrastructure projects for Palestinians. And I was often the only soldier in the room, liaising between UN bodies, the US government, the aid agencies, and many other organizations, alongside the settler councils, the Palestinian councils, and the Israeli government itself. I learned the ins and outs of the conflict and went through my own personal development of not knowing exactly how I can make change. I felt as though maybe I should stay in the military and try to change the system from within. And I had a lot of really great mentors there and felt that the system was too broken. I decided to leave and work with organizations on the outside. Through a series of experiences with different organizations, I ended up back at Kids for Peace, begging them to hire me. And it was a really crazy experience. You see, cross-border organizations that bring together Israelis and Palestinians are working in a context where we're bringing together people who are not allowed to be brought together. Right? There are literally walls and barriers and so many challenges in the way, making it culturally and actually just physically difficult to be together. When I came into Kids for Peace, we were a tiny organization, and throughout several years, we had the opportunity to grow. We brought in at certain points 150 families a year for long-term weekly engagement, 6-year program, and it was one of the most empowering experiences. We were able to raise significant funds and reach new communities. We changed our rhetoric from engaging anyone who wanted to meet with the other to the areas most affected by the conflict. And it seemed like we were growing and this movement was really being built in partnership with other organizations until we hit a major funding block. We, along with many of the other organizations, and I'm sure Basheer will speak to this as well, were funded by the US government. And with almost no notice, we lost our funding. This was a huge blow, not just to Kids for Peace and the organization that I was working in, but to more than half of the peace building efforts on the ground. This was in 2018, when the situation was just coming out of a series of several wars and violence in the streets in Jerusalem. And yet somehow there was momentum for peace building to continue. But without resources, the organizations that were already struggling could barely survive. At this point, I started going crazy as an organizational leader, trying to raise funds and continue the work, and realized that we needed to partner with all the other efforts and the other organizational leaders that were trying to build peace and bring Israelis and Palestinians together. We needed to fundraise together. We needed to strategize together, combine our work, and build a movement. Through this, in conversations with Basheer, where we would get off topic from the work we were supposed to be doing in Kids for Peace, we just were strategizing and philosophizing how we can bring everyone together to coordinate and engage the work of Israelis and Palestinians at all levels of society together. We both stepped down from our different roles. Basheer was working in a variety of organizations, which he can explain. And we started to engage donors and organizations in a major mapping, where we asked, what are they doing? What are they struggling with? Where are they? And that report we can send, I can even put it in the chat, which you can read, which is a mapping of all the peace building efforts that are existing in Israel-Palestine today. And I have to tell you, there's a lot of good energy, and there's not a lot of professionalization. And it came to feel clear that the reason that peace building wasn't working and the efforts weren't unified was because it was just too hard. The people that are working on the ground, first of all the Israelis and Palestinians are still living the conflict and need a lot of support. That, we or our spouses, our children are going off to war, are fighting, are facing discrimination. On the Israeli side is one challenge, on the Palestinian side it's many others. And the staff and the professional workers in this field need support. At the same time, there's no incentive, because without a political horizon, this vision of preparing for peace feels too far away. And so we felt that the Israeli and Palestinian civil society needs to own the process itself and start unifying as a movement to create that rhetoric. And so we stepped out about a year and a half ago to create Amal-Tikva, which is now a space where we're providing strategic planning toward peace building together with the whole field. We're engaging organizations that are bringing together Israelis and Palestinians from all different walks of life, whether it be top level diplomacy with politicians, with religious leaders, women's groups, youth movements, educational institutions, medical engagement at all levels, to first of all operate strategically and professionally on their own, and at the same time to coordinate with one another so that they're part of a movement that is strategically reaching every single level of society, so that we can change the perception on the ground. Conflict that I've learned from Gary is only intractable, it's only a zero-sum game if you believe that it is. And if we can change the hearts and minds of Israelis and Palestinian people to believe that the conflict is solvable as long as we want it to be, then it will be.
Thank you, Meredith. We will now turn to Basheer.
Thank you, David, and hello, everyone. I hope everybody, I hope I'm loud and clear. I'll start by telling everybody that, my interaction with the whole conflict really took a turn only in the recent years. I grew up in an environment which wasn't really a typical environment for a Palestinian to grow up in. Originally, I'm from a very small village up north in an area, the technical term is the triangle area, a small village called Zelafi, which is very close to to Nazareth. I think that's the biggest city that everybody's familiar with. And, growing up, for me as a kid, interaction with Israelis wasn't something that was out of the ordinary. It was something that I used to engage in on a daily basis. Also having two parents, a dad that used to work in Channel 1, which is the national channel back then of Israel, and a mother working for the Ministry of Education. They had Israeli friends, and it wasn't something out of the ordinary. And we didn't really talk about the conflict. It wasn't something that was on the agenda. We were a normal family trying to maintain a normal life, work, having peace with our neighbors, etc. And I think now, thinking back then, the starting point where I really became to acknowledge the reality was when we moved to Jerusalem. My dad got a managerial position where he was forced to be on a daily basis in Jerusalem. So naturally, we moved together with him to Jerusalem. And that was when I was supposed to start my university studies. I registered to the Hebrew University, School of Finance, Accounting, and back then, just as today, I spoke very, very fluent Hebrew. People always used to comment that I didn't even have an accent when I spoke Hebrew, which I used to take as a compliment. Not realizing that it's something that needs a deeper thought. And during the university, I maintained normal student life. Partying, trying to experience the whole thing without really, thinking about what's going on. But but naturally, the moment you stepped into the Hebrew University, you would immediately see that it was divided into groups. You had the Israeli group, you had the Palestinian group, you had the foreigners group. There were normal interactions, but it's not something that I could say that it was sort of let's say a community or something that you would think that was normal. It was you would engage with people only on a need basis, or if there's something formal or there's an event, etc. And even during my studies, the second Intifada started, and even then, for me, I didn't really personally, I didn't really sense that there was a major effect on me. I continued my studies. I was working back then at a cafe company, which was in the western side of Jerusalem. But at the same time, I was living at an Arab neighborhood called Bet Safafa, which in a way, made me even more, want to maintain a normal life. Sort of not thinking about the conflict because, about the second Intifada and the reasons, etc. But deep down inside, I always knew that there was a big difference, from where I grew up and Jerusalem. Jerusalem, from my personal experience, is divided into two. You have the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, But even in Jerusalem itself, you also have the Palestinian conflict. You have even in the Palestinian community in Jerusalem, I'm also considered sort of an outsider. And the reason for that is because I'm tagged as an Israeli Arab. The fact that I'm from up north, I have an Israeli citizenship. So for Palestinians in East Jerusalem, I was sort of, okay, you're an Arab, you're a Palestinian, but you're still different. These issues, today I think of them more deeply, but back at the time, I used to sort of not give them a very serious or deep thought. I was just trying to, live my life, get an education, get a good job start building my future, etc. And the main, I think the first real time that I think that I really started to think that everything in this country has to do with your ethnicity, with your nationality, was when I started my internship at PwC. I applied for many companies, but eventually PwC was one of the first companies that gave me an internship. And the fact that I was an Arab was the reason for me that I got promoted in the company, which is somewhat not normal, because usually in Israel, Palestinians are sort of, I'm not going to say neglected, but they're not in the top priority to be given, promotions. So the shift came when they wanted to open a branch in East Jerusalem. So they wanted to transfer from West Jerusalem, from PwC Western branch to the PwC Eastern branch, East Jerusalem branch. And for me, that was a really change in even the way I thought, even the way I think. Because, at the age of 23, having 23 years of, talking, studying, working, I saw a question, what is PwC? PwC is short for PricewaterhouseCoopers. It's considered one of the big 4 international companies for auditing and accounting. As I was saying, the fact that I started, was transferred to East Jerusalem for me was a change, even culturally. Even though I'm Arab, and even though I talked for the past 23 years, worked in Hebrew or English, at home I speak Arabic. With my friends I speak Arabic. But speaking is one thing, and working in Arabic, writing and reading is a very different thing. There was a very big change for me regarding the clientele, the mentality, how to approach people. And I think back then I started to realize and really understand the differences, even between Palestinians. Certain things that were normal for me seemed not normal for Palestinians in East Jerusalem. But nevertheless, the fact that I worked with PwC, got me to my next step, which was, working as a financial manager for a international Israeli company called Basheer. For those who know of Basheer, I got a job as a financial manager for one of their branches in Jordan. Now, the reason I'm telling that because unconsciously over there was the first time that I realized I was facilitating without even knowing that. in Jordan, it's closed now. You know, back until the year 2012, there was an area called QIZ zone, Quality Industrial Zone, where it was part of the peace treaty between Israel, Jordan, and the USA, where you had basically the Israeli know-how, the Jordanian manpower, and the American clientele. So they created an industrial zone where they had major companies that operated from there. So the CEO of the factory where I worked in was Israeli. You know, he was an Israeli, a religious Jew that came to the factory in a kippah twice a week, who spoke mainly Hebrew, very small, very little English. You had the Jordanians who were sitting on the table who spoke only Arabic or English, and me, who I spoke 3 languages. So basically, I was sort of managing the meeting, you know, facilitating between everybody, and at the same time trying to do my job. So, so yes, as I said, that was my, you know, subconscious first interaction as a facilitator. And when I came back in 2010, you know, having the intention of getting married, I came back to Israel, and I started, you know, looking for my next step. And by coincidence, a friend of mine recommended me to start as a financial consultant, as a freelancer financial consultant with one of the very known NGOs in Israel, Sikui, for those who know it. And that was the beginning of my career with non-for-profit companies. Of course, from there, I started working with various other organizations, mainly organizations that dealt with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, each in their own way. And you know, during which I got married, I had a kid, a firstborn called Larin. And you know, during the time that we were planning, you know, to start our household, we were searching for a house, for an apartment, and surprisingly, we found a very nice apartment, very affordable, in a neighborhood ironically called Holy Land. And it was mainly the tenants over there were mainly, you know, Israeli Jews. I think aside of it was me and maybe other 2 families that were the only Arab tenants in that neighborhood. And you know, once you're a father, things that seem to be normal or things that you didn't think of take a different turn when you face certain issues as a father. And you know, during the period that we lived in Holy Land, you know, another riot period started, which, as the media called, was the Knives Intifada. You know, basically there were, you know, Palestinians, you know, assaulting Israelis all over the city of Jerusalem. So the reason I'm telling this story was because that was really a game changer. You know, at the same time, I was the CFO of Hand in Hand. Hand in Hand is an NGO who runs, actually it's the only NGO that runs schools for Israelis and Arabs together. So at one hand, I was trying to do my part, you know, in giving whatever I can in trying to, you know, create a better reality, you know, something that I believed in. But at the same time, the neighborhood that I lived in, you know, they were trying to get all the tenants to make them aware that there are Arabs working and living in the neighborhoods, and that they should be very careful not to open their doors, especially for the employees that were maintaining the premises. You know, that was the first incident that I was really shocked in. You know, coming home from work, you know, doing what I do, entering the lobby, and I see, you know, a flyer on the billboard of the entrance to the building from the building management, you know, to all the tenants, please do not open your doors for any of the Arab employees. You know, it didn't say employees, it said Arab employees. So the second incident for me was, you know, my oldest Lanine back then was 2 years old. So we used to go down and play in the park. And it was the same period where the Knives Intifada, as the media calls it, was in its peak. And, you know, she was a 2-year-old just starting to walk, just starting to talk. And she was, you know, calling out to me like Baba Baba, which is daddy in Arabic. So immediately you could see, you know, all the people in the playground like started to look at me differently, you know, raise an eyebrow. And I think that was the time when I realized that, you know, maybe the things that I thought were normal are not normal. Maybe it was all in my head, you know. And you know, very shortly after that, we decided to move to, you know, 5 minutes away from there, which was Beit Safafa. And I think from that point, I started to realize that, you know, in order to make real change, you know, things need to be done from bottom to up. You know, any legislation that's imposed on a society, I don't think it can really have a major impact. And as Meredith said, you know, my work with Meredith started Kids for Peace, you know, after finishing with Hand in Hand, you know, because I felt that, you know, I needed to move on. And as Meredith said, you know, our work, we started focusing on other stuff that we saw that needed to be dealt with. And I think that's where we decided that we wanted to create Amal-Tikva, you know, because personally, I believe that, you know, from my experience, you know, many organizations, they do tremendous work, you know, and they could have even more impact, you know, on society. But the reason why they are not is very simple. You know, they're lacking basic infrastructure, you know, things that, for example, you know, building a budget or how to pay salaries, you know, very simple stuff that you don't think of, but because they're engaged, you know, having the burden on your shoulder, you know, trying to make a change, try to solve the Israeli-Arab conflict, you don't really give much thought, you know, to the basic stuff. So I think that's the reason why me and Meredith decided to create Amal-Tikva. And I guess that's it.
Thank you so much, Basheer, and each of you. We're going to move into Q&A, and since we have a lot of participants, I think it's questions. Send me a message in the chat, and I will field them and kind of make sure we go in some order. I want to start with the question. Each of you, you're dealing with societies that you have interaction at a constant level, but you don't have real serious dialogue about any of the things, for example, Basheer, you were talking about that you personally observed, or Meredith, you were talking about. And Gary, I know you have plenty of experience. How do you get from kind of being familiar with being around people to actually having real dialogue about issues? And I bring this up because in the United States, obviously this summer, we've had lots of discussion and tension about racial issues. And these, you know, that's led to some dialogue and on grassroots level. So Gary, if you want to kick off.
Yeah, and listen, in our space for a while, David, a number of people avoided those very difficult issues, but we realized, I suppose in the early 1990s, we got the phraseology that was used was we ended up with a mutually hurting stalemate. So we realized a number of key actors, politically, religiously, academically, business people realized we can kill each other for another several hundred years. I mean, we've been doing it quite well for hundreds of years previously. So we really needed a kind of game changer. And in that sense, a number of people began to facilitate, I suppose, what we called uncomfortable conversations. I mean, a writer in the Middle East, a number of people know called Micah Goodman. He's a research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute. I've spoken there in Jerusalem. I mean, he said a very interesting thing about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He said, those at the center of the debate must replace paralysis with pragmatism. Interesting, he says, the silence of the Israeli center abandons the conversation about the future of the territories to the hard right or to the hard left. And their monopoly over the conversation, Goodman says, creates this undesirable false illusion. So the only options are to manage a non-sustainable status quo or to solve an intractable problem. So he suggests the Israeli political center should offer a middle way, but it remains quiet, it remains apathetic, it remains preoccupied with other affairs. We were exactly the same. But a number of people, key actors in civic society, began to take what I call thoughtful strategic risks. So clergy people, I was one of the youngest, began talking to the IRA. Begs the question, should you talk to people who are pursuing political violence or terrorism? I would argue strongly, the only way to get people to give up their guns is to have conversations within a certain framework. There's no question about that. So people need to deal with the major issues. United States, I remember a colleague of mine a number of years ago in a university in Upper West Side in Manhattan said, no one in the United States wants to talk about the legacy of slavery. I remember responding to him and saying, interesting, there's a fascinating S word. Let me tell you my S word, which is sectarianism. Because no one in my space wanted to talk about the legacy of sectarianism. And it was only when we put those real issues on the table that people began to have constructive conversations. They need to be managed well. I mean, I've made the argument strongly, David, you know, that I think religious spaces, synagogues, churches, mosques, temples, universities. I mean, look at the real estate academia and religious actors have in the United States. And I often ask myself the question, we need to use these spaces for uncomfortable, difficult conversations. To me, it's absolutely crucial to hear and understand the other. When that began to happen in our space, and it was not hugs and kisses initially, trust me, it wasn't, but people began to humanize the other person. I mean, Abraham Joshua Heschel, the Jewish theologian who walked with Martin Luther King Jr. during the civil rights movement in the 1960s, said, dehumanization precedes genocide. You dehumanize another person, it's much easier to kill them. So how do we create spaces to humanize the other? And the other thing, both in your space and in my space with Brexit and in the Middle East, I mean, Jonathan Sacks, as we all know, the great Jewish theologian, passed away there over the weekend. His funeral was yesterday. I once spent time with Jonathan in London a couple of years ago. Jonathan Sacks uses the phrase linguistic violence. Is there linguistic violence in the United States? Categorically, yes. Is there linguistic violence between Israelis and Palestinians? Categorically, yes. Is there linguistic violence in the Irish-British space around Brexit? The answer is yes. So what then does civic society do to create spaces to tone the rhetoric down, to allow people to disagree well? I'm not asking Republicans to become Democrats or Democrats to become Republicans, but people need to create space for a new beginning within your space, in the Israeli-Palestinian context. We are still doing this 22 years after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. It's a generation's work to begin to heal those spaces.
Let me ask Basheer or Meredith, do either of you want to respond to this? Then we've got a whole bunch of other questions coming in, so we'll try to keep them brief.
I have one, a very short sentence, then you can add in, Meredith. I agree with Gary. You know, dialogue is very crucial. It's a start. You know, it's a start for everything. But after a while, I think you have an added value. You need to add on something to that. You know, I think in addition to dialogue, creating a mutual interest, you know, can trigger the whole issue of wanting to create a change. Because, you know, from what I saw, you know, most of the organizations working in Jerusalem are about dialogue. But after a certain time, you can see that people are, you know, okay, how much can we talk about the conflict? How much can we talk about our feelings, what we think, et cetera, et cetera? It's important. It's very important. But I think having a mutual interest, creating something that both sides want, you know, is also something that needs to be taken into consideration.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, I think Basheer and I are totally on the same page. We work a lot with the organizations and trying to strike a balance and reminding them that they're also part of the conflict themselves, right? Like nobody is outside of it. And so we did a huge research. 20 years after Oslo, there was a period where there was a lot of research done on peace building movements and on dialogue and on the personal transformation that you go through when you meet with the other and you realize that you want to change the way that you're interacting with them and you want to push for societal change. And a lot of the research showed that the graduates of these programs were not actually making change, right? And so dialogue wasn't enough. And so a lot of the programs post this research era where we were seeing that dialogue wasn't enough, started only doing programs for action and based on shared interests and forgetting the dialogue part because it wasn't important. And that wasn't working either because the relationships fall apart, right? And so you have to be striking a balance between, you know, concrete projects for change that you can be working on together, between, you know, opportunities where you're sharing specific interests, you're creating businesses, entrepreneurial activities, or, you know, playing flutes together or doing sports together, or all different ways that you can be interacting. But you have to also remember that dialogue has to be part of it. And so setting part of your, you know, regular routine as providing a space to talk about it. And, you know, Basheer and I have to force each other and ourselves to open up because we're working all day, every day. And occasionally, you know, it comes to a head where it's hard, where, you know, my husband or my brother is in the army and reserves, we're in a conflict and we need to figure out how to also hold that. Or, you know, he's facing challenges and discrimination on issues based on the fact that he's Palestinian and I'm trying to, you know, ignore it and do our work. And we can't do that. We have to pause and we have to address it. And nobody is above that. And that always has to be part of it.
Thank you. I'm going to read this next question. 21st century grassroots activism on social issues appears to start out in one direction, and then movements get infiltrated with those that want to resort to violence or act in direct contradiction to the original intent of the movement. It seems like centralized and organized leadership that provided face-to-face guidance, like the ones seen in the 1960s civil rights movements, were more effective in containing chaotic behavior. Is this correct or just 2020 hindsight? And can the decentralized social media-driven movements of today be as effective as those in previous years and bring about legislative change? I'm going to ask Gary to briefly answer this.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, David. And I mean, and there's 101 case studies around that. I mean, if you want to contextualize it in my space, I mean, a civil rights movement began in my space in the late 1960s with Catholics, and many liberal Protestants were also involved in that. There's still a whole debate goes on. Was that hijacked by the IRA or was it not? And there's a number of different narratives around that. The key thing in relation to all that, I would say, because there's 101 studies, did they not? The irony is that people who end up pursuing violence still have to sit around the negotiating table at the end of the day. And I mean, it was back channels into both militant groups in my space, namely the IRA, UVF, UDA, and other people who eventually had to come to the table and have the conversation. So the answer to that, yes, in some cases, yes, and in some cases, no. But whoever asked the question, the key component in all this is leadership in the public space. People have to be in the public space. No matter why they're academics, women's groups, politicians, we can't hide behind this fortress door mentality. Change takes place in the public square, and we need good leadership in the public square. Now that entails courage coming about there. I mean, I'm just looking at a couple of things here. I mean, Peter Wiener, who's a former top official in George Bush's administration, said, you've got to give voice to what each side fears can help us make progress. So he said the administration should never underestimate the importance of people feeling like they are heard. So in the new administration that's coming in the United States, it's crucial they create spaces or empower civic society to create spaces to ensure people are being heard. And primarily what Meredith and Basheer are trying to do is empower organizations at grassroots, both economically and within a dialogue framework. Because peace processes have to be twofold. There needs to be political and social change, but there also needs to be economic change. And one of the key components to the Irish peace process, like it or not, was serious finance was put into this space by the International Fund for Ireland and the European Union. And that allowed grassroots organizations to be effective and to be healthy on the ground. But I go back to that question, to me, leadership is absolutely crucial. And one of the reasons you're going back there to the 1960s, one of the reasons we look back today to Martin Luther King Jr. was because of that effective, non-violent discourse and bravery and courage that he gave in a very fraught, difficult situation. There's many leaders we've forgotten about, but we haven't forgotten about him. And I think most of us know the reason why.
Thank you, Gary. Next question, and I want to, as I ask this, I also remind everyone that our guests are working on the grassroots level, not at the government level necessarily. But the question is, can you talk about America's involvement in these conflicts? Has it been helpful or unhelpful? And if so, why?
David, I'll take and then pass them out. Look, in our space, the American administration, and let me just say this to a very divided America at the moment, both Republican and Democrats played a very strategic key role in our peace process. Absolutely no question about that. I mean, Bill Clinton was one example where Bill Clinton gave a visa to Gerry Adams. Now, for those of you who don't know, Gerry Adams was a spokesperson for the most lethal terrorist organization or freedom fighter organization, whatever phraseology you want to use in Western Europe. Now, I know categorically people within the American administration, the Secretary of State, and other people said to Bill Clinton, President Clinton, this could destroy your presidency. But he took what I call a strategic risk. And in doing that, he brought people in who assumed that the only way to achieve their political goals was through violence, and he showed them another way. I remember when Bill Clinton came to Belfast, and I know David and Meredith know this story, and I see Shula and a number of other colleagues on here as well. Bill Clinton did his keynote address behind my church. He left that space and went down a road called the Springfield Road, the Falls Road, and Gerry Adams, coincidentally, in inverted commas, just happened to be coming out of the morning bakery carrying his scones. Clinton got out of his vehicle and shook the hand of Gerry Adams. Now, people were saying, what the hell is the leader of the free world doing, shaking the hand of the spokesperson for the most violent terrorist organization in Western Europe? Why was he doing that? He was giving leadership. And what he was doing, he knew that there was a struggle within the IRA. Do we continue political violence, or do we go for politics only? Clinton was clever. Clinton was empowering Adams to persuade the hard men of Irish republicanism there's another way to do business. So the answer is categorically yes. And that was continued in the Bush administration and other awards. So categorically, the United States, as regards the Irish peace process, have been excellent. As regards others, I will not comment. I let my other colleagues do that. And they're still interested, to this day. I mean, every American consul has been in Belfast. I've had a close relationship with. I met a number of key actors. They come in, and to give them credit, they don't just sit in their office. They're on the ground. They're out meeting grassroots organizations and supporting them and empowering them. So to Americans who may feel depressed today or in elation as regards the Irish peace process, both Republicans and Democrats played an absolutely key role, categorically.
I think I'm going to use my prerogative as the moderator, kind of stop at the Israeli-Palestinian side, because that could be a whole nother seminar. We have 15 minutes left. I want to keep talking on the societal level. So I'll turn to Basheer and Meredith and ask this question. You're working in a very difficult context. How do you measure success?
That is an excellent question. I do want to take one step back and not address, don't worry, any of the political ramifications of the recent US government decisions, and just take a second to show the link that I sent. The US government has passed, the House has passed, and we're up for vote in the Senate this year in the appropriations bill. So you should call your senators, some newly minted, some more veteran, and make sure that they support the institution of the International Fund for Middle East Peace, which is based off of the International Fund for Ireland. And right now it looks very likely that there's going to be almost the exact model, basically, because of how successful it was in Northern Ireland in bringing out civil peace in Gary's time. We're learning the lessons of what worked and what didn't work, and building that moving forward. And so it's very likely that, we'll be having this conversation in 20 years and be able to say the US, started the International Fund for Middle East Peace, and that investment in civil society was critical in bringing about peace between the Israelis and Palestinians, which I believe that we'll be able to say. And one of the questions in that, as we're working together, actually we're on a series of calls regularly with Gary, some of his colleagues at the International Fund of Ireland who've been very supportive, and exactly the question you just asked, David, of how do we measure success, right? And this is a lot of the work that Basheer and I are doing inside the organizations, because they don't, a lot of the biggest problem, and you can see in the report that we just put out as well, of why the organizations are not able to prove that they're successful, is because they measure it to peace, right? Like, we are a youth choir bringing together Israeli and Palestinian kids to sing, and therefore did we make peace? And if you're constantly measuring yourself to this big lofty goal of, everybody singing, standing in a circle and singing Kumbaya, it's not going to work. And so one of the pieces that we're developing is how, within a context of peace building, we can support the organizations in building a concrete theory of change, right? That if we are successful inside our organization, we're contributing to all of these different pieces of the conflict, right? And so we have defined that bringing about a more peaceful reality is not saying it's over, right? We learned from Gary, 22 years later, they're still working on legacy issues. There's still efforts of reconciliation. There's still post-conflict resolution, and we know that's going to be the case. But breaking it down into individual pieces, into the systems of interaction, into institutionalized racism, into checkpoints, into the disparity in medical care, into all of the different areas, right? And if we can support the organizations that are working to make change in specific areas, and strategically as a movement saying we need to break down the problems and the painful systems of interaction that we have between Israelis and Palestinians, and bring them systematically together, and so that we can, have a better day-to-day life that is actually making us realize that we want to live peacefully with the other, learning each other's languages, engaging in interactions in terms of business partnerships. This is what's going to bring us. And so there's not one answer, because you can't measure up just to peace, right? And it's these smaller pieces of making it more manageable.
Okay, I've got another question. If any of you have any of you found the interfaith movement or interfaith studies useful in creating dialogue and fighting humanization?
Yeah, I'll take that. I mean, and to say categorically, religious actors have a role to play. But I think it also needs to be said as well, religion's not clean in all this here. And I'm saying this as a religious actor. I mean, I'm ordained 33 years. So, I mean, it's been a lifetime in a sense. I mean, let me quote Jonathan Sacks in memory of him. I mean, his funeral was yesterday in London. I mean, Sacks said this, on one point, and it is a substantial one, the critics of religion are right. Religion has done harm. It has led to crusades, jihads, inquisitions, and pogroms. It has shed the blood of human sacrifice in the name of high ideals. I mean, people have hated in the name of the God of love, practiced cruelty in the name of the God of compassion, waged war in the name of the God of peace, and killed in the name of the God of life. These are undeniable facts, and they are absolutely terrifying. And, you know, Sachs says this, and I think people need to hear this in the United States and in the Middle East and in my space. I mean, religion is a very, very powerful force. It bonds people as a group. It moves people to act. It changes lives. And whatever is power can be used, misused, and abused. So religion's like fire. It warms, but it also burns. And we are the guardians of that flame. So what religious people need to ask themselves is my religion warming people's hearts, or is it burning people? And the irony is, sometimes you don't. I remember doing theology at Queen's University in the 80s. Never once did I hear about the Crusades or the Holocaust or anything else. It was all about these early church fathers, as if Christianity was some form of utopia. I mean, Christianity is a very bloody history. And I mean, quote me on that. I'm not really disturbed at my age if I offend some of my fellow religious cohorts. That is a fact. It is a very bloody history. Other people can comment about their constituency and its history as well. So yes, religion has a role to play. But I want to say very strongly, religion needs to be honest, transparent. It needs to learn to repent when it gets things wrong. I mean, sometimes, and I'm quite happy to say this, churches can be the most dishonest spaces on planet Earth. So I'm happy to be part of an interfaith movement, be part of dialogue, as long as it's honest, it's open, it's transparent, and as Meredith and Basheer said earlier, it's not kumbaya. I don't want to be sitting around singing nice hymns, holding hands, and assuming it's all okay, when deep down inside, we know it's not okay. So I'm going to put honesty, transparency, integrity, courage, and leadership on the agenda for those who are involved as religious actors.
My next question is for Basheer. I'll direct it to you first, and that is, you know, you're each coming from a community, and Basheer, yours is even more interesting because you have an Israeli Arab identity. So you're Palestinian, but you're Israeli citizen. And you're advocating for dialogue and peace. Do you get blowback from your own people? And of course, I could ask this to either of the three of you.
Yes, the answer is yes. You know, and the immediate, you know, anger is basically based on lack of knowledge. Now, if I go back to my Israeli Arab part, you know, as I said, it's something that's normal. You know, Israeli Arabs up north. As I said, interaction with Israeli Jews is something that's normal. But if you go to East Jerusalem or the West Bank, you know, I had many eyebrows risen when I said that I work with the Israeli IRS, or that I engage with governmental institutes, because it's directly takes a negative path, you know, and a very big part of that is due to lack of knowledge, you know, because you have even in the Israeli side, you know, I can give you an example. One of the board members of Hand in Hand You know, he lives in Herzliya. Herzliya is a city who is in the center of Israel, very close to Tel Aviv. And, you know, he told me once, you know, you are the first Arab that I really have, you know, very serious interaction with, you know, and that's because, you know, they never really had the opportunity, and it's the same goes for the Palestinian side. You know, you have many Palestinians that never had the opportunity, you know, to engage, you know, even in a normal conversation with the other side. So of course, people that don't know about the other side, you know, they tend to get a little bit, you know, intimidated by the whole situation.
Thank you. Let me ask you each, how have governments responded to your efforts on dialogue? I know Gary can look at this with hindsight because he knew the leadership on all sides, but Meredith and Basheer, have you gotten any feedback from the Israeli government or Palestinian Authority?
I can tell you that any positive engagement with a governmental institute is always under the radar. You know, I had personal interaction with many government officials that they were pro a certain idea. They wanted to promote it, but it couldn't be on an official level. It always had to be under the radar. You always had to maneuver, you know, find other solutions so that they can implement the idea. That's my experience.
Complicated. You know, on the one hand, we're under insane audits just by working with Palestinians, and we can't make bank transfers, and we are just dealing bureaucratically with being an organization that engages Palestinians, trying to employ Palestinians. I mean, all the systems are against us. At the same time, I've never actually met someone and spoken about our work and received negative feedback. And that includes, you know, at conferences where I'm engaging with a lot of right-wing, especially religious actors, because they know that they have to be the ones to speak out and say all the negative things, but that behind the scenes, the work of civil society. And I mean, the truth is, Gary could probably speak to this more. He has more of a high-level relationships with Israeli and Palestinian government officials probably than we do, because they can learn about what worked there, but they can't be supportive of it publicly here, right? And the reason is because society's not demanding it. There's not a desire for peace. We've had 4 elections in the last year and a half. And none of them was peace, was the negotiations, was the conflict even on the table. It's not an issue that you can vote for because it's not an issue that people are talking about right now. And that's part of our agenda, is to get it back on the table.
I think, David, I had probably 1,000 Israelis and Palestinians with me in Belfast of all shades of opinion: Jewish Home, Maritz, Likud, Arab Joint List, and everyone in between. It's absolutely crucial in a peace process. You do have to bring in your extremes. And really, as Basheer said, sometimes it is the private versus the public. Within the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at the moment, there have to be private conversations until you build a critical mass to allow those ideas to go public. That happened in the Irish peace process. During the 80s, I was having conversations and other colleagues that under no circumstances, if we had made it public, I'm not saying it would have endangered our lives, but it may have been a little bit risky. But there was a time when a critical mass was built, which allowed people to actually go public. So when Israelis and Palestinians are here, they're saying they're learning things, lessons from our peace process, not that it's identical, but there's certain lessons like political leadership. How do we break the cycle of violence? A lack of trust is a given in those early days of negotiations, that ultimately, while security is important, there comes a time when we realize that military efforts will not solve any conflict, and the role of civic society. So those are lessons that they say to me. I'm not, under no circumstances am I going to be like some people who say, well, the Good Friday Agreement is the blueprint for the Middle East. It's not the blueprint for the Middle East, but they're lessons within our space and other spaces on that long, protracted journey to peace that may be applicable for the Middle East. I will let those living in the Middle East decide what is applicable and what is not. There are enough arrogant politicians, religious leaders, academics out there who give us this imprimatur, this is the only way. We need to empower civic society. In the Israeli-Palestinian context, let them resolve it. If we can help, we do that. I think the Americans have a part to play, Europeans and many others. We're there as equippers and influencers, not benign dictators. It's up to people on the ground.
Well, thank you. We are running out of time, so I'm going to ask one last question before we close, and that is, you just mentioned lessons, Gary. So as Americans ponder systemic racism, some of the questions that emerged very clearly the last year, what lessons can be learned from these conflicts?
Okay, I think we'll just...
I can.
Yeah, can you still hear, David? Okay, I just saw
I
the
can.
recording is ended, but it's not. So listen, I'm look, I think the thing is say as well, look, America's not in a good place. There's no question about that. But I think as well, people within the United States need to have the belief that things could actually be different. I mean, I'm the eternal optimist. So listen, I'm going to quote George Washington. This is my final thing. He wrote a letter to the tourist synagogue, Newport, Rhode Island, honoring American Jews. And in it, he said that one of the most remarkable achievements of the American Republic, that is also one of the United States' lasting contributions to nations across the globe, its insistence that no matter how individuals worship or how they identify religiously, they will count as full and equal American administrations. Any American administration, that has to be central. None of this kind of hierarchy of betterness, politically, religiously, that, as Washington said, they will count as full and equal American citizens, no matter how they worship or identify religiously. Americans need to hear that today, categorically. And I do think, David, spaces need to be created where people can hear each other. I mean, just a final story, and then I'll pass to my colleagues. I remember preaching in the United States several months after President Trump was elected. And I was told categorically by a large church in the United States of 3,000 members, Gary, under no circumstances dare you mention Clinton or Trump in the pulpit. Because if you do, you could split my church right down the middle. So I asked myself the question, if religious people, be they from Judaism, Islam, or Christianity, cannot create spaces where people disagree well, I mean, what does that say for religion and this concept of healing, listening, disagreeing well, when we can't even address what we disagree on? Maybe religion in the United States needs to take a healthy look and hold a mirror up to itself and ask, what kind of moral framework are we creating for the future if we can't disagree well?
Thank you, Gary. Meredith, Basheer, do you want to top George Washington?
Okay.
Yeah, I just say that we feel like we need to be able to dialogue to get to a place of really agreeing with each other, and we don't, right? You don't have to get to a place where you understand and can really see their perspective. You can just listen, and that in itself, and holding that and being able to sit there and listen to somebody be hurt by you and have trouble with your existence, and that you being who you are is in conflict with everything that they stand for, and just listen and respect and hold that, and know that that doesn't have to change who you are. You don't have to apologize for who you are, for what was done in the past. You just need to listen to each other and respect each other. And that in itself is an incredible first step and very powerful.
Thank you. Basheer, you have any closing comment, or you?
No, I Meredith just, I couldn't explain it better than Meredith. This is what I always say. It's perfectly fine to disagree. It's perfectly fine to have different opinions. It's perfectly fine also to fight. But as long as a moment later you walk out the door and everything is fine, you continue to engage. I think that's what matters.
I want to thank all three of you for joining us. It was really an interesting conversation and hopefully a useful one to everyone who was online today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Best wishes, everyone.
Take care.